The most common kind of mood disorder is major depressive disorder or depression, major depression. And although many of us say we feel depressed, this isn't the same as being clinically depressed. So we may feel sad, and sometimes this is in reaction to something that's happened in our lives. Perhaps somebody that we love has died or is very ill, and that makes us feel sad and helpless, and it's very difficult to deal with that from time to time. But what's different about clinical depression is that the feelings are much more intense and it lasts much longer. So you feel sad and helpless every day for weeks, and you may feel so sad that you don't think life is worth living, that things are never going to get any better, so you feel hopeless. Things that you used to really enjoy a lot aren't bringing you any pleasure anymore, so that's anhedonia. And these thoughts may be so extreme that you may feel suicidal. It's very common that people that are suffering from depression have difficulty sleeping. This is known as a vegetative symptom. And they may not have trouble going to sleep, but they wake up in the middle of the night and can't go back to sleep again. It also seems that sleep-wake cycles are disrupted in another way, in that they go more quickly into REM sleep than other people, perhaps only after 45 minutes of being asleep, whereas it usually takes most people longer than that. There's often very little energy, reduced appetite, and difficulty concentrating. So there are both cognitive and non-cognitive elements to depression. Depression is more common in women than it is in men, so about twice as common in women than in men. It affects about 5% of adults every year in the US, and it has about a 10% lifetime prevalence. So that means that over the course of somebody's life, about 10% of people will suffer from depression. And it can affect people anywhere from adolescence to old age. And there are generally, you can divide major depression into two groups according to when it onsets. So if it's early onset, so under the age of 30 years, it has a stronger genetic component than if it onsets later in life. And you see people that have this early onset depression are more likely to have other relatives that have depression or anxiety disorders, more likely to have relatives with ADHD, substance abuse disorders, bulimia, migraine, and irritable bowel syndrome. So there's something about these disorders that may have some common genetic underpinnings. In addition to genes, there are also other biological influences which may make it more likely for some people to suffer from depression than others. Hormonal changes, for instance, in women can trigger episodes of depression, and so there's sometimes increased levels of depression when women go on the contraceptive pill or after the birth of a child. So actually about 20% of women do suffer postpartum depression after the birth of a child. And again, at menopause, hormonal levels change and could trigger episodes of depression. But men are not safe either. So middle-aged men typically experience decreased testosterone, and along with that is an increased likelihood of developing depression. Now, it's not clear exactly how that's linked, whether it's just biological. It could also be psychological too, because testosterone affects sex drive, so you would have reduced sex drive, and perhaps that's one of the things that makes you more depressed during middle age. Depression has also been linked to low levels of thyroxine. So thyroxine is produced by our thyroid gland, and so if you have low levels of thyroid hormone being produced, you're more likely to be depressed, especially if you've had depression in your past. So if you have a a predisposition, perhaps a genetic predisposition to being depressed, it's even more likely to occur. So again, not everybody that has low levels of thyroxine are going to suffer from depression in the same way that not everybody that has a child, not every woman that gives birth to a baby gets depressed. These are just things that increase the risk. Also, if you think about what we said about the right hemisphere being the emotional hemisphere, sometimes people that have left hemisphere strokes become depressed as well. So there maybe is something about the left hemisphere that helps to keep us a little bit more balanced psychologically, emotionally. So depression, not surprisingly, is often treated by prescribing antidepressants. And a lot of these drugs, it wasn't known how they worked when they were initially prescribed. It just was, let's try something and see if it works. And these are drugs that have found to be effective in treating depression. And now because we have a better understanding of how these drugs actually work, it helps us to better understand why depression might occur. So one type of drug that's used as an antidepressant are drugs that are tricyclics. And these block transporter proteins, and so they prevent the uptake of monoamines into the presynaptic terminal. So the monoamines that they affect, there are 3 of them, hence tricyclics: serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. So what's happening here is basically that they're blocking the reuptake. Those transporter proteins are generally help the neurotransmitters to be removed from the synapse and taken back up into the presynaptic cell. But if you have these tricyclics, what they're doing is they're blocking that protein, those transporter proteins from working, and so they're blocking the reuptake into the presynaptic cell, and therefore they hang out in the synapse for longer. Now, the problem with tricyclics, even though it means that we have more of these neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft, means that they act very widely on different parts of the brain. So they're not necessarily just acting on the parts of the brain where we want them to have an effect. And so there are lots of side effects with these kinds of drugs. So they block histamine receptors, so they can make you drowsy. They block sodium channels, which can make the heart beat irregularly. And they affect acetylcholine receptors, which can give us a dry mouth or even problems with urination. So one of the reasons why tricyclics may be prescribed is because something else isn't working. And in fact, tricyclics are fairly frequently prescribed by doctors. One of the reasons why they're not tolerated so well is because of the side effects. So the other type of drug that's very commonly prescribed for depression are SSRIs. And these work kind of like the tricyclics do, but they only work on the serotonin transporters. So they only affect the reuptake of serotonin. And so these include drugs like Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil. So just like the tricyclics do, they affect the transporter proteins, but only those that attach to the serotonin. So only serotonin is going to be increased in the synapse. They have some mild side effects. They sometimes cause nausea and headaches, and they can increase anxiety, but often the side effects are less wide-reaching than they are with the tricyclics because they're only affecting one neurotransmitter. The other major type of drug that are prescribed as antidepressants are MAO inhibitors. such as NADL. So what's an MAO inhibitor? So there are two ways that you can get a neurotransmitter out of a synapse. Well, there are multiple ways, but for these particular neurotransmitters, one is that you can take it back up into the presynaptic cell. So that's what we've been talking about with the first two types of drugs, where a transporter protein attaches to the neurotransmitter and basically it gets beamed back up into the presynaptic cell. So it's no longer in the synapse. Another way that the body and the brain has to get rid of neurotransmitters from a synapse is to use enzymes to break down the neurotransmitters. So monoamine oxidase does exactly that. It breaks down the monoamines. And so if you have an MAO inhibitor, it stops those enzymes from working and again increases the availability of the enzyme of the neurotransmitter in the synapse. So these work on serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. So the monoamines are those three. And it means that there's more of these neurotransmitters that's available in the synapse. And these drugs are typically prescribed for people who don't respond to SSRIs or tricyclics. And you have to be very careful with these by avoiding certain kinds of food. So if you eat food that contains tyramine, which is an amino acid, and it's present in cheese and raisins and liver and pickles, these can combine with the MAO inhibitors, and they can very rapidly put blood pressure up very high, and you can have a stroke or a heart attack. So it can be life-threatening. So people that take these kinds of drugs have to be very, very careful with their diet. They have to be really vigilant about what they eat. But the fact that it works on these three different neurotransmitters often means that people actually have very good control over their depression symptoms if they do take these drugs. So it seems that if MAOs are effective, MAOIs are effective, it must be that multiple neurotransmitters are involved in depression. It's been suggested that perhaps dopamine or lack of dopamine is related to the symptoms that we get of anhedonia. So these are, remember, symptoms of not feeling pleasure. So if you think about drugs of addiction increasing dopamine, things that we like increase dopamine, and so if we have a reduction in dopamine in the reward areas of the brain, that's why maybe we're not feeling pleasure anymore when we're depressed. Norepinephrine has been linked to psychomotor symptoms, so when we feel very sluggish and tired and we can't really move, that may be because we have low levels of norepinephrine. And then finally, serotonin. We talked about low levels of serotonin in the previous podcast being related to OCD. And it may be that low levels of serotonin could be related to obsessive thoughts of sadness or guilt or worthlessness or hopelessness in depression. More recently, neuroscientific research has shown us that perhaps antidepressants don't work in exactly the way that we thought that they did. If you think about what's happening at the synapse, when you take a drug, there should be an increase in neurotransmitter level within a few hours at the synapses. But usually people don't get that fast relief from their symptoms. Most benefits take days or weeks to alter behavior. And so it seems that it's not just about the neurotransmitter levels at the synapses. If you keep taking antidepressants, it actually stimulates the release of neurotrophins, and particularly BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And it's thought that we've talked about BDNF before when we've talked about development of the nervous system and how it's important for the continued survival of neurons. So unless neurons receive this, they're going to die during development. And so perhaps what's happening during depression is that there isn't enough BDNF in the brain, especially in the hippocampus, and so you get shrinkage of brain areas. And so what's been suggested is that one of the things that antidepressants do is increase the levels of this factor, this neurotrophin, and so it can help to restore certain brain areas, particularly the hippocampus. We know that BDNF is also important in long-term potentiation for learning new associations, and so perhaps this is another piece here that if we can increase BDNF levels, then we can learn new associations, we can have more positive thoughts and memories, and perhaps lose the connection for the sadder memories. So you might be wondering, what's the most effective treatment for depression? And here's a little chart that helps you to answer that question. You can see on the left you've got various psychotherapeutic interventions, and on the right you've got drugs, medications, but you've also got placebos. So if you notice that 30% of people that suffer from depression actually respond to a placebo, that makes you sort of think about the efficacy of these other treatments. In general, drugs are most effective when they're given for severe depression rather than for mild depression. And therapy is certainly as effective as medications if it's interpersonal therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. So how does therapy work? Well, why doesn't everybody do therapy? Well, therapy costs more than drugs do, and it takes a lot more time than just taking a pill every day. And perhaps the combination of drugs and therapy is the most effective, which we don't actually see on this chart. Therapy works in a very similar way to the way that the drugs that we've talked about in this podcast work. So they increase neurotransmitter levels at the synapses, and they also increase neurotrophin levels. So it just takes longer for that to occur. Finally, ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy, is also sometimes used to treat depression. And ECT has had a lot of bad press, but in today's medical field, it's really given to patients in a very humane way. So it's only given when patients are really in a lot of danger, so they're suffering from severe depression and perhaps suicidal. And it's given in conjunction with muscle relaxants, and sedatives. So people are not experiencing the trauma that they did back in the day. If you watch some of the movies, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where people are describing very horrific experiences with ECT because they weren't sedated, and so what it is basically is that you give an electrical stimulus to the brain, and you induce a seizure. So when people have ECT treatment, it's usually given every other day for about 2 weeks. And there's some side effects, so sometimes there's some memory loss as just leading up to the ECT therapy period, but because what's happening here is that you're having difficulty consolidating memories. But if you only do the ECT on one side of the brain, particularly to the right hemisphere, you don't have as many problems with memory. And it seems that what this ECT treatment does is to stimulate neurogenesis in the hippocampus. So again, it's probably increasing neurotrophins in the hippocampus, and there's something about having a healthy hippocampus that helps to reduce the symptoms of depression. Another treatment for depression is using TMS. This is transmagnetic stimulation, where you put a magnet on the brain and you can induce electrical activity in the brain. And so it might work in a similar way to ECT. It's not, it doesn't usually produce seizure. It was discovered that this was effective when people were trying to treat patients with schizophrenia to try and alleviate their hallucinations. And actually what they found was that it reduced their depression. So it seems to increase neurogenesis, and perhaps it which we know is occurring in the hippocampus. So perhaps it works in a somewhat similar way to both drugs and to ECT. Another treatment for mild depression is regular aerobic exercise, perhaps because it increases blood flow to the brain, but also decreases cortisol levels. And again, here's the hippocampus coming into being implicated in depression, because we know that if you have increased cortisol levels, remember cortisol is the hormone that is released when we experience high levels of stress. Those high levels of cortisol can affect the hippocampus and shrink the cells of the hippocampus. So again, it seems that having a healthy hippocampus is protective against depression. I've spent a lot of time talking about major depressive disorder, but another kind of mood disorder is bipolar disorder. And here people alternate between depression and periods of mania. So in depression, major depressive disorder, let's go back and talk about that some more, people are going between episodes of depression and feeling normal. So but bipolar disorder, there's more of a mood swing from being very high, feeling very excited, restless, feeling like you can do anything, to feeling depressed and sad. And cycles can last different amounts of time in different people. Some people who cycle very rapidly, they may have one day being depressed and the next day feeling manic, or a cycle could last weeks or years. And there are two major types of bipolar disorder. Bipolar 1, you have full-blown episodes of mania, such just as I described. Or bipolar 2, the mania isn't so marked. It's more like mild agitation and anxiety. About 1% of the population has bipolar 1, and a further 1% has bipolar 2. So bipolar disorder in general affects about 2% of the population. And the average age of onset is in the early 20s. So young adults are more affected by this. Children are typically not. There's a hereditary basis to it. So it's a genetic component to it, and we know that from twin studies. And it's a stronger genetic component than depression. So in monozygotic twins, the concordance rate is 0.5. That means that if one twin has it, then there's a 50% chance that the identical twin will also have it. In dizygotic twins and in siblings, it's much lower, so it's only about a 5 to 10% chance if your sibling or your dizygotic twin has bipolar disorder that you will also have it. And again, with all these disorders, it's not one specific gene that's implicated, but multiple genes. Neuroimaging studies have shown how dramatically the brain activity changes between cycles of mania and depression. So these are PET scans, and you can of somebody's brain taken over different periods of time. This is somebody that's actually cycling pretty rapidly. And in the top row, you don't see a lot of color in the brain. It's mostly blue and a little bit of green and a little bit of yellow at the back here, but not a ton of activity. So this is a depressed period, and then just a day later there's a lot of activity in the brain, as you can see by the yellow and red here, and this is a period of mania, and then almost 10 days later you see they've gone back to being depressed again. So these are PET scans, and what we're looking at here is glucose metabolism. So not a lot of metabolism in these two rows, but a lot in the manic period in the center. The treatment of bipolar disorder is quite different from the treatment of depression. In fact, you don't use antidepressants at all while somebody who has bipolar disorder is feeling depressed, because you could easily switch them over to mania. Instead, depending on what kind of bipolar disorder they have, one of two types of drugs are usually prescribed. Lithium is more effective for bipolar 1 disorder, and it helps to stabilize mood, but it's also a potentially very dangerous drug because it doesn't take very much to be toxic, to have side effects that are very dangerous for people. So it has to be very carefully regulated, and you have to have enough for it to have an effect. And there's a very fine line between enough and too much. On the other hand, if people have bipolar 2 disorders, they're more likely to be prescribed valproic acid. Both of these drugs, lithium and valproic acid, have common effects in that they reduce glutamate activity. Remember, glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, and so you can imagine if you have a lot of excitation in your brain, then that could be related to the mania. So it helps to decrease the mania. It also decreases the AMPA receptors in the hippocampus. So if you think back to what we knew about long-term potentiation, part of what's happening there is that when we have a lot of glutamate, the NMDA receptors get involved, and the sort of the long-term effects of that are that more AMPA receptors get produced. And so by reducing glutamate activity, that's going to decrease the AMPA receptors in the hippocampus. So maybe that's related to this. Is that we've talked about the hippocampus as being maybe important for mood regulation, and if you've got a very sluggish, not very responsive hippocampus, so it's not producing very many new neurons, then you're more likely to be depressed. And if you've got a hippocampus that is being stimulated by a lot of glutamate, it's going to produce a lot of AMPA receptors. Perhaps that's what makes you swing to a more manic mood. Another common action that these two drugs have is that they block the synthesis of a brain chemical called arachidonic acid. And arachidonic acid is produced during brain inflammation. And so perhaps during these episodes, this substance is increased in concentration in the brain. So the fact that it blocks the synthesis of arachidonic acid is a good thing. Omega-3 fatty acids, which you find in seafood, also help to counteract arachidonic acid effects. And so it's been suggested that in countries where they eat a lot of seafood, such as in Japan, they have lower rates of bipolar disorder. the last mood disorder I'm just going to very briefly mention today is seasonal affective disorder. It's sometimes referred to as SAD. And seasonal affective disorder is exactly that. It occurs only in certain seasons. It's usually a less severe kind of depression than occurs with major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder, and it regularly occurs in the winter. It may have a genetic element to it, but basically where it's been suggested that because there's less light at that time of year, that it affects mood, and you see delayed both temperature and sleep cycles. So people with seasonal affective disorder tend to go to sleep later and wake later than normal. So they have a sort of a shift in their sleep-wake cycles. And the best way to treat people with this disorder is to use bright light therapy. So just being exposed to bright lights seem to be more effective than using antidepressant drugs.